He may even identify himself with it and believe that he is what he appears to be.
Welcome to the NCE Study Guide. I created this study guide using ChatGPT and Notebook LM. So think of these modules as AI-powered audio flashcards. Each one of these 20 modules contains 10 mock questions representing the kind of questions that you might encounter on the National Counseling exam. I created this primarily for myself, and I decided to make these available to anyone else who might benefit from this kind of study aid. But please note, while I have done my best to ensure that these modules align with NCE content, I encourage you to cross-reference them with trusted study guides and resources for the most accurate preparation. These modules are not affiliated with or endorsed by the NBCC or any official licensing board. And today I'm introducing a new case study module. Now, as you may already know, I took the NCE and I passed it a few weeks ago, but I learned so much from putting these modules together, and I enjoy seeing the downloads increase and hearing from listeners who reach out. So I've decided to take this case study approach to kind of bridge that gap between prepping for the NCE and really getting started as a mental health care professional in the field, really understanding the ethics and the different modalities and the interventions and how would I do a diagnosis for certain situations. So that's what you're going to be hearing in these case study modules. And I also want to remind you that I'm putting together a grassroots study group for anyone who is looking for some real life person interaction as you prep for the NCE, not just these AI puppet shows. So if you're interested, email me at ncestudyguide@gmail.com. So, with no further ado, here are your AI study buddies from Notebook LM. Enjoy.
Nice to be in orbit.
All right, learner, welcome back to another deep dive. And today, we're going to be looking at something that's specifically designed to help you prepare for the NCE.
The National Counselor Examination.
Exactly. So this is actually case study module 2 of 10, and we're going to be going through a bunch of these different modules over time.
Awesome.
Absolutely. And, our mission today is kind of twofold. First, we want to kind of introduce this NCE study guide and how it can be helpful to you. And second, we're going to be thoroughly exploring the first 5 sections of a sample case study that's provided in this study guide. So we're going to be looking at kind of the how to learn and the what to learn today.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah, and so this NCE study guide actually comes from Glenn Osland, and Glenn recently went through the NCE himself and passed, and he developed these research-backed modules as part of his own preparation to really gain a practical and applied understanding of all these different counseling concepts.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and the way the study guide came together is quite unique, and Glenn refers to it as an AI puppet show.
Interesting.
So let's unpack this a bit. He uses ChatGPT as kind of the first step to help him draft and refine these different case studies. And within that, he's doing a lot of work with different counseling theories and research findings and ethical considerations, and all that gets plugged into ChatGPT.
We're really harnessing the power of AI to really explore every facet.
Right. And then from ChatGPT, all that content gets put into a very detailed Google Doc. And then from there, it gets uploaded into Notebook LM. And Notebook LM is an AI tool that then takes all that material and kind of synthesizes it. And Glenn gives it specific instructions to explore that content from a bunch of different angles.
So it's almost like having a dedicated study partner who's constantly prompting different ways to think about the information that you're taking in.
Right. And the result is a learning experience that is rich in dialogue and really mirrors the kind of critical thinking that you need to engage in when you're taking the NCE.
Awesome.
So now if you learners are out there and you're thinking, man, I could really use some help with the NCE, or I'd like to connect with some other people who are also studying, Glenn actually facilitates a weekly study group for listeners.
That's awesome.
So if that sounds good to you, just send an email to ncestudyguide@gmail.com and you can join that group. And also, if there are certain case study topics or counseling issues that you'd like to see covered in future modules, please feel free to send those suggestions to Glenn as well.
Yeah, it's so cool how he's incorporating that collaborative element into this exam prep.
Right. So it's really a living resource. And with that background on the NCE study guide itself, let's turn to the featured case study for today, which is Case Study 0002, Alyssa, the Self-Critical Achiever. And this case study is followed by 10 NCE-style multiple-choice questions to help you build your clinical reasoning and exam readiness.
Really putting it all together. So we're looking at a realistic client scenario and then thinking through how we would approach it as counselors, which is what that exam is all about.
Exactly. So we'll start by kind of looking at the first 5 sections of this case study. And the first section is called Presenting Problem. And in this section, we learn that Alyssa is a 27-year-old woman who has recently experienced the end of a long-term romantic relationship.
Okay.
And since the breakup, she's reporting emotional overwhelm, frequent crying, spells a lot of negative self-talk, and some increased social isolation.
It's pretty rough.
Yeah. And on top of all that, she's about to start a new job. So she's really kind of in this period of transition. And she's seeking to regain some emotional balance in her life, build her self-confidence, and also cultivate a stronger sense of self-love.
It's really understandable that she's seeking support.
Yeah.
With all of those things going on, a relationship ending and a new job starting, it's a lot of change.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the next section is history. And in this section, we learn that Alyssa has no prior experience with therapy.
Okay.
Her family background includes an emotionally distant and critical father, and also an over-involved but loving mother.
Oh, so interesting family dynamics there.
Right. There's no reported history of substance use or any significant medical issues.
Yeah.
And Alyssa describes herself as being impulsive and also having difficulty regulating her emotions.
Okay.
But at the same time, she also appears to be very motivated to understand the patterns in her life, and she seems to be genuinely eager for personal growth.
That's great that she has that motivation for growth because, those family dynamics that you described, distant father and over-involved mother, they can often really impact a person's attachment style and their ability to kind of manage their emotions and regulate themselves.
Right, and those are things that she's going to have to work through.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the first formal section, which is ethical considerations. And the first consideration that's highlighted is informed consent. So it's important to really clearly review with Alyssa the boundaries of confidentiality in therapy, and also make sure she understands the structure and the process of how therapy is going to work.
Of course, this is that foundational part of therapy, making sure that the client feels safe and understood and that they know what they're getting into.
Right. Second, the guide points out the importance of emotional safety, and this is especially important with Alyssa because she's reporting these difficulties with emotion regulation. So the counselor is going to need to be really vigilant about monitoring for any potential indicators of self-harm or suicidal thoughts.
Right. It's absolutely critical that we assess and really monitor for safety, especially when we're working with clients who are struggling with intense emotions and having trouble managing those emotions.
Right. And the third consideration is dependence and boundaries. And the guide points out that because Alyssa has this history with an over-involved mother, there's a heightened awareness that she might be prone to developing an over-attachment in the therapeutic relationship.
Yeah, this is a classic example of how past relationships can really show up in the therapy room. So the therapist needs to be really attuned to those dynamics and address them proactively and set good boundaries.
Right. And the final ethical consideration that's highlighted is cultural sensitivity. So the counselor is going to have to consider the influence of Alyssa's family dynamics, any societal or gender roles that she's internalized, and also kind of broader societal expectations and how all of that is affecting her and how she perceives her current situation.
It's so important to take a culturally sensitive approach with every client to make sure that we're being respectful and relevant and meeting their needs in a way that makes sense for their background.
Right. And that brings us to section 2, which is assessment and diagnosis. Yeah. And based on Alyssa's presenting problems and her history, the study guide suggests a likely diagnosis of adjustment disorder with mixed anxiety and depressed mood.
Oh,
and the key here is that there's this clear connection between her distress and the recent breakup and also the stress of this new job that she's about to start. So there are these identifiable stressors.
And that really is the key differentiator with adjustment disorder because the symptoms have to have developed within 3 months of that stressor. And there's the expectation that they will go away within 6 months of the stressor going away or the person kind of adapting.
Right. So it's very much tied to a specific event or set of events as opposed to, say, persistent depressive disorder where you have to have symptoms for at least 2 years, or generalized anxiety disorder, which is kind of excessive worry across a lot of different areas of life.
Exactly. It's much more pervasive and long-lasting.
Right. And the guide also mentions some rule-outs or alternative diagnoses to consider. And it lists things like persistent depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and even some possible personality features like borderline personality disorder traits.
Yeah.
But it emphasizes that none of those are really likely based on the initial information that we have, and that adjustment disorder is probably the best fit.
It makes sense that we would consider all of those and rule them out as part of a differential diagnosis.
Right. It's important to consider all the possibilities.
Yeah.
And then the guide mentions some specific assessment tools that could be helpful, and one of those is the BDI-2, which is the Beck Depression Inventory.
Yeah, that's the classic self-report questionnaire that measures the severity of depressive symptoms.
Right. And the guide also mentions the DERS, the Difficulties in Emotion Regulation Scale, and this scale is specifically designed to assess those challenges with managing emotions.
And we know that that's something that Alyssa's reporting that she's struggling with, so that'll be a good way to get some more specific information.
Right. And then finally, the guide points out that the clinical interview itself is a very valuable assessment tool. And it also encourages Alyssa to do some journaling to kind of track her emotional patterns and notice any potential triggers.
It's great to have that combination of standardized measures like the scales and then those more qualitative methods like the interview and the journaling.
Absolutely. And that brings us to section 3, which is theoretical approaches. And the guide outlines 3 potential theoretical approaches that could be particularly helpful.
Okay.
The first one is DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. And DBT is really focused on targeting emotion regulation and distress tolerance. So this seems to align well with some of the challenges that Alyssa's reporting.
Yeah, DBT is great for helping people manage those intense emotions and learn to tolerate distress. But I think it's important to note that it might not be sufficient on its own for someone like Alyssa because it doesn't always explicitly address those deeper relational patterns that come from early attachment experiences.
Right.
It does have a module on interpersonal effectiveness, but something like attachment-based therapy could really help her unpack how those early bonds are showing up now and affecting her relationships and her view of herself.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
And the second approach is attachment-based therapy. And as you mentioned, this approach would address those insecure bonds that likely stem from Alyssa's relationship with her emotionally distant father and her over-involved mother.
Right. And the idea here is that those early relationships create these internal working models of relationships.
Right.
And those working models influence how we see ourselves, how we see other people, whether we think our needs are going to be met. And they basically shape our expectations for relationships.
It's like a blueprint that we carry around.
Yeah, exactly. And for Alyssa, you can see how those inconsistent parenting experiences might have created this working model where she's anticipating instability. She's worried about people not being there for her. And those fears could be contributing to her anxiety and isolation.
Yeah, and it makes sense that she'd be kind of hesitant to get close to people if she doesn't think that they're going to be there for her in the long run.
Absolutely.
And the third approach is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And CBT would be helpful in identifying and reframing Alyssa's self-critical and distorted thinking patterns.
Yeah, because we know she's dealing with that negative self-talk.
Right. And one of the techniques that's often used in CBT is something called schema therapy. And schema therapy focuses on those really ingrained lifelong patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that are called schemas. And these schemas usually develop from unmet needs that we had in childhood. So for example, Alyssa might have a schema of I'm unworthy, and the schema could have developed from her father's critical messages, and it's probably contributing to her negative self-talk and her low self-esteem.
Yeah, and schema therapy would help her understand where that belief came from and how it's playing out in her life, and then start to challenge and change that belief.
Right, so it's kind of getting to the root of those thought patterns.
Exactly.
And that brings us to section 4, interventions. And the guide breaks this down into different phases of therapy.
Yeah.
So in the early phase, it suggests incorporating DBT skills training, and it specifically mentions mindfulness and emotional labeling as some initial techniques.
Those are both great for building that foundation for change.
Right. Mindfulness can help Alyssa become more present and more aware of what she's feeling without judgment. And then emotional labeling helps her to really identify and understand those feelings accurately.
Yeah.
And the guide also recommends CBT thought logs as a tool to help Alyssa start to see those cognitive distortions that are happening in her thinking.
Yeah, thought logs are so helpful because they provide this really structured way for the client to really externalize those thoughts and start to examine them and challenge them.
Right. And then moving into the middle phase of therapy, the guide suggests doing some psychoeducation about attachment theory. And this can help Alyssa understand how her early experiences are influencing her current relationship patterns and her sense of self.
Yeah, so she can start to connect the dots.
Right. And then also in the middle phase, the guide recommends identifying those schemas that we talked about and also working on developing assertiveness skills and self-compassion.
Yeah, so in that middle phase, it's about helping her understand where those difficulties are coming from, both relationally and in terms of her thought patterns.
Right.
And then also giving her those tools to have healthier relationships and be kinder to herself.
Right. And then finally, the guide offers some examples of progress indicators or positive changes that we might look for as Alyssa progresses in therapy. And these include improved self-awareness, better emotional regulation, the development of healthier boundaries in her relationships, and a reduction in her negative self-talk.
So those are all really good signs that the therapy is working and that she's internalizing those skills and starting to feel better.
Right. And that brings us to the final section of the case study, which is section 5. Key takeaways for the NCE.
Okay.
So this section kind of pulls out some of the most important points that we can learn from this case study as they relate to the NCE.
Sounds good.
So the first takeaway is that the case demonstrates the appropriate use of a diagnosis like adjustment disorder when the client's distress is really clearly linked to a specific life event.
Yeah, that's really important to understand for the NCE, knowing when that diagnosis is applicable and when it's not.
Right. And the second takeaway is that it highlights emotion regulation as a key treatment target for Alyssa and how DBT can be a very helpful and effective approach.
You want to be familiar with those evidence-based treatments like DBT and know why they're chosen for particular situations.
Right. And the third takeaway reminds us about those ethical responsibilities of being a counselor, including the importance of monitoring the client's safety and also avoiding the development of any kind of unhealthy dependence.
Right? Ethical considerations are woven all throughout the NCE, so it's really important to be thinking about those ethical implications.
Right. And the fourth takeaway shows how CBT can be used to really address those cognitive distortions that we often see with people who are struggling with low self-esteem.
Yeah, CBT techniques like identifying and challenging those negative thoughts are definitely something that's assessed on the NCE.
Right. And then the fifth takeaway focuses on the importance of those early attachment experiences and how they can shape our struggles later in life and how therapy can help us to kind of heal from those early wounds.
Understanding attachment theory and its implications for counseling is crucial, and it sounds like it's going to show up on the NCE as well.
Okay, so now, learner, it is time to put on our NCE thinking caps.
Let's do it.
Because we are moving into Section 6, NCE-style review questions.
Okay.
So we have 10 multiple-choice questions that are related to Alyssa's case. We're going to read each question. We'll go through all the different answer choices, and then we'll restate the question, give you the correct answer, and then a detailed rationale for why that is the correct answer.
This is great practice for the actual exam.
Right. So let's get started. Question number 1. Based on Alyssa's presenting issues, which diagnosis is most appropriate?
No.
A, generalized anxiety disorder. B, major depressive disorder. C, adjustment disorder with mixed anxiety and depressed mood. D, persistent depressive disorder.
So the question is, based on what we know about Alyssa, what is the best fitting diagnosis?
Right. And the correct answer is C, adjustment disorder with mixed anxiety and depressed mood.
Okay.
And the rationale here is that her emotional distress is clearly developing in response to those identifiable stressors that we talked about. The breakup and the new job.
Right.
And there's no indication that these symptoms were present before those events occurred. And remember, adjustment disorder is specifically used when there's a reaction to a stressor.
That makes sense.
Generalized anxiety disorder involves excessive worry that's not really tied to a specific event, and it has to be going on for at least 6 months. And major depressive disorder requires more severe depressive symptoms that are present for at least 2 weeks.
And Alyssa's not quite meeting those criteria.
Right. And persistent depressive disorder is a more long-lasting chronic pattern of depression, and that doesn't really fit with this recent onset that we're seeing with Alyssa. So the key really is those identifiable stressors and the timing of her symptoms.
Gotcha.
All right, question number 2. Which modality is best suited to help Alyssa with emotional regulation and impulsivity?
Okay.
A, psychodynamic therapy. B, narrative therapy. C, dialectical behavior therapy. D, reality therapy.
So this question is about which therapy approach would be most helpful for Alyssa in managing her emotions and her impulsivity?
Exactly. And the correct answer is C, dialectical behavior therapy.
Okay.
And the reason for this is that DBT is really specifically designed to address emotion regulation and impulsivity, and there's a ton of research that shows that it's effective.
That's good to know.
Yeah, and DBT teaches all these concrete skills in areas like mindfulness, distress tolerance, emotion regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness.
So it's really giving her tools to work with.
Exactly. And, the other therapies might touch on those things, but DBT is really focused on them directly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, for example, one of the skills that's taught in DBT is the S.P skill,
Okay.
which stands for stop, take a step back, observe, and then proceed mindfully.
I like that.
Yeah, so you can see how that would be really helpful for someone who's struggling with impulsivity.
Yeah, right in the moment.
Right. Question number 3. Which assessment tool is most appropriate for identifying challenges in emotional regulation?
Okay.
A. MMPI-2B. Durs-Seebeck Anxiety Inventory. D. Rorschach Inkblot Test.
So this question is about which assessment would give us the most information about Alyssa's specific difficulties with emotion regulation.
Right, and the correct answer is B, DIRS, which is the Difficulties in Emotion Regulation Scale. And the reason this is the best answer is that the scale is specifically designed to assess the different parts of emotion regulation. So it looks at things like how well someone can identify and describe their feelings, how well they can control impulsive behaviors when they're upset, and how easily they can access coping strategies to manage their emotions.
So it's a really targeted tool.
Right. The MMPI-2 is more of a general personality test.
Yeah.
The Beck Anxiety Inventory, it measures anxiety, and the Rorschach is a projective test.
Right. And those could give us some information, but the DARS is really the most direct way to look at those emotion regulation challenges.
Exactly. Question number 4. What attachment style is Alyssa most likely displaying based on her family history and current relationship struggles?
Right.
A, secure. B, anxious, preoccupied. C, avoidant, dismissive. D, disorganized.
So this question is about applying attachment theory to Alyssa's situation and figuring out which style best describes her.
Right, and the correct answer is B, anxious, preoccupied. And the rationale here is that her history with her mother, who was over-involved but loving, and her father, who is emotionally distant, kind of created this pattern of inconsistent parental availability.
Right, so she wasn't getting that consistent, secure base from her caregivers.
Right, and that often leads to an anxious, preoccupied attachment style where people crave closeness, but they're also very anxious about their relationships, and they worry about rejection and abandonment.
It's like they're always on edge, worried that the other person's going to leave.
Right, and that really seems to be fitting with Alyssa's experience. You know, she's distressed about the breakup, she wants connection, but she's also isolating herself.
It all kind of ties together.
It does. Question number 5. Which CBT technique would be most useful in early sessions to address Alyssa's negative self-talk?
All right.
A, empty chair. B, thought records. C, miracle question. D, free association.
So we're trying to pick the best CBT technique to help Alyssa with that negative self-talk.
Right, and the correct answer is B, thought record. And thought records are really helpful because they're a fundamental technique in CBT, and they help clients to really understand and challenge their negative thoughts. And, you know, in those early sessions, just bringing awareness to those thoughts is a really crucial first step.
Yeah, just noticing them and writing them down.
Right. And a thought record typically involves writing down the situation, the automatic negative thought that popped up, any feelings that came with that, any evidence that supports that thought, any evidence that contradicts that thought, and then trying to come up with a more balanced alternative thought.
That makes sense. It's really taking those thoughts from inside your head and putting them out there where you can look at them objectively.
Right. And the empty chair technique is more of a Gestalt therapy technique.
Okay.
The miracle question is used in solution-focused therapy, and free association is a psychodynamic technique.
Right. So those aren't really CBT techniques.
Right. Question number 6. Which of the following statements best reflects a potential ethical concern with Alyssa's case? A, she is showing signs of mania. B, she may become overly dependent on the therapist. C, she is unlikely to attend sessions consistently. D, she may need inpatient treatment immediately.
So we're looking for the ethical issue that is most likely to come up in Alyssa's case.
Exactly. And the correct answer is B. She may become overly dependent on the therapist.
Okay.
And the rationale here is that because Alyssa has this history with an over-involved mother and a distant father, that can create this vulnerability where she might seek that care and attention from her therapist and kind of repeat that dynamic.
It's like she's trying to get those needs met that weren't met in childhood.
Right. And this obviously raises ethical concerns about boundaries and the therapist's responsibility to help Alyssa become more independent and not create a situation where her needs are kind of getting mixed up with the client's treatment.
It's so important to be aware of that as a therapist.
Absolutely. And the other options don't really seem to be supported by the information that we have.
Yeah.
We're not seeing any signs of mania or that she's not going to attend sessions or that she needs to be hospitalized. Right.
Question number 7. Which of the following is a primary goal of attachment-based therapy for Alyssa?
Okay.
A, reduce suicidal ideation. B, improve academic performance. C, explore and repair early relational wounds. D, replace irrational beliefs with rational ones.
So we're trying to get to the heart of what attachment-based therapy is all about.
Right, and the correct answer is C, explore and repair early relational wounds.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and the main focus of attachment-based therapy is to understand how those early experiences with caregivers have shaped our attachment patterns and how those patterns are showing up in our relationships today.
Right.
And the goal is to help the client process any unresolved issues from the past and develop a more secure attachment style so that they can have healthier relationships now.
It's all about those early experiences and how they're still affecting us.
Exactly. And while reducing suicidal ideation and, fostering more rational beliefs could be outcomes of this therapy, those aren't really the primary goals, and improving academic performance isn't something that's typically focused on in attachment-based therapy. Right, it's really about those relationships.
Right. Question number 8. Which of the following symptoms would suggest that Alyssa may meet the criteria for a personality disorder?
Okay.
A, anhedonia. B, emotional dysregulation and identity disturbance. C, sleep disturbances. D, perfectionism.
So we're looking for the red flags that might point to a personality disorder.
Right. And the correct answer is B, emotional dysregulation and identity disturbance.
Okay.
And the rationale here is that when someone is having a lot of difficulty regulating their emotions to the point where they have intense mood swings and they also have a really unstable sense of self, they're not sure who they are, what their values are, what their goals are. That can be a sign of a personality disorder. And specifically, those are some of the core features of borderline personality disorder.
Those are those key characteristics.
And the other symptoms that are listed, anhedonia, sleep disturbances, and perfectionism, can be present in a lot of different mental health conditions, so they're not as specific to personality disorders.
So that makes sense.
And it's really important to remember that just because someone has some of these symptoms doesn't mean that they definitely have a personality disorder.
Right. It's important to do a thorough assessment.
Absolutely. Question number 9. Which response from a counselor reflects an ethical and culturally sensitive approach with Alyssa?
Okay.
A, your father's neglect probably isn't relevant anymore. B, try not to dwell on your emotions. Let's move on. C, it's important to understand how your family shaped your view of yourself. D, let's focus only on your work-related stress and forget about your childhood.
So we're trying to pick the response that shows the most respect and understanding for Alyssa's experiences.
Exactly. And the correct answer is C. It's important to understand how your family shaped your view of yourself.
That's a good one.
Yeah. And the reason this is the best answer is that it's validating Alyssa's experiences, and it acknowledges how important her family history is in understanding her current struggles. And it shows that the counselor is being both ethical and culturally sensitive because they're respecting her narrative and they're considering that broader context of her development.
Yeah, and you definitely don't want to dismiss her past or her feelings.
Right, like options A, B, and D are doing.
Exactly. Those are not good responses.
And finally, question number 10. Which of the following outcomes would indicate therapeutic progress for Alyssa?
Okay.
A, Alyssa continues to isolate and cry daily. B, Alyssa ends therapy after 2 sessions. C, Alyssa reports using DBT skills during emotional moments. D, Alyssa asks for daily check-ins with her therapist.
So we're looking for the sign that the therapy is actually helping Alyssa.
Right, and the correct answer is C. Alyssa reports using DBT skills during emotional moments.
Okay.
And the rationale here is that when a client is able to take those skills that they've learned in therapy and apply them in their real life, that's a really good sign that they're making progress.
It means that they're internalizing those skills and using them to cope.
Right, and we're specifically talking about DBT skills here, like mindfulness or distress tolerance, because those are the skills that are most relevant to her challenges.
Yeah.
And the other options don't really indicate progress option. A suggests that things are staying the same option. B might mean that she's not happy with therapy, and option D could be a sign of unhealthy dependence.
Yeah, those aren't good signs.
And that brings our deep dive into Alyssa's case and those NCE-style review questions to a close.
That was great.
Yeah, it was a good one. And remember, learner, if you found this module helpful and you're interested in connecting with other people who are studying for the NCE, be sure to check out Glenn's weekly study group. You can get more information by sending an email to ncstudyguide@gmail.com, and please feel free to send in any suggestions for case study topics or counseling issues that you'd like to see covered in future modules.
Yeah, we love hearing from our listeners.
Absolutely, and we hope this has been a valuable step in your journey to NCE success.
1, 2, 3.
Nice to be in orbit.